In my last video, I explained how ASML transformed the relationship with suppliers from being ordinary suppliers to full partnerships with each of their 5,000 suppliers. This was necessary to achieve the highest rate of innovation and cooperation needed for the newest generation of semiconductor technology, extreme ultraviolet lithography, also called EUV. But what about the customers of ASML? What role do they play in the entire semiconductor value chain? To discover this, I will analyze the evolving relationship between ASML and Samsung, one of the most well-known companies in the world. As I explained in my video of the history of ASML, in the beginning they didn't have any big customer. Yes, they had TSMC, but in the 1990s they were also a relatively small company compared to a giant like Intel. It's in the fall of 1993 when the sales manager of ASML receives a phone call from a purchase manager of Samsung. This is highly surprising for several reasons. Firstly, ASML has never been called by a potential customer to discuss a deal. Secondly, ASML has been trying to lure in Samsung for years. However, Samsung always came up with a long list of specific requirements where ASML was producing one-size-fits-all machines. As a result, several times the negotiations failed and ASML basically had given up on Samsung. What ASML didn't know at the time was that Samsung was so offended by the market leader of the time, Nikon, that they decided to switch suppliers immediately. Where in the US ASML was discussing prices, delivery times, etc., in Seoul they only have one question: how can ASML help South Korea? In the beginning of the 90s, South Korea is booming, and the Samsung conglomerate is the proud leader. In a matter of barely 9 years, they went from a 0% market share in the memory chip market to market leader, with a market share about 10%. In my video about the suppliers of ASML, I highlighted the differences in culture between the startup ASML and the 150-year-old company of Carl Zeiss. Again, national cultures reflected in corporate cultures also played a major role in the deal between ASML and Samsung. Basically, the Korean culture was seen by ASML as a superlative step of their direct Dutch culture. Sometimes, when the people of Samsung didn't get their way, it became physical and objects flew through the room. Samsung always stuck stubbornly to their specific demands, and sometimes they would even take the passports of the Dutch staff of ASML. After months, the two parties ultimately arrived in the final negotiations about the price of the machine. The purchase manager of Samsung begins and says, "We determine the price you will receive for your machine." The sales managers of ASML are stunned and they leave the room immediately. The price Samsung was offering meant that ASML wouldn't make any profit on it, but they would get their so desired first customer. ASML walked away because they knew the real value of their machine. With the value of ownership concept I explained in my first video, ASML could show every customer that their machine was cheaper in the long term. Because it was more productive and more reliable than its competitors, the cost per chip produced was always lower with ASML machine. A month after ASML walked away from the negotiations, Samsung called with the request to talk. Shortly after, that deal was closed and finally ASML had their first big customer. Samsung also did a good deal because they did get all the specific requirements they asked for, forcing ASML to deviate from their one-size-fits-all model they sold so far. In 2001, ASML wants to take over SVG, an American chip machine producer. The Pentagon is afraid, however, that the technology for espionage might fall into the wrong hands with this takeover. It's the first time in history an American president has the final call. After the approval of George W. Bush, Intel becomes the next big client for ASML. From this moment on, ASML has the 3 biggest chip producers in the world as their most important clients. Today, the sales to TSMC, Samsung and Intel account for 70% of the total sales of ASML. As I explained in my last video, ASML is highly dependent on its suppliers to be able to deliver the high-tech machines that they do. But there's a strong interdependence between ASML and their customers too. The reason for this is that both ASML and their customers do not have the time to wait for a chip producing machine to be fully developed. If they would wait for a perfect machine, keeping up Moore's law of doubling the capacity of transistors for every 2 years is impossible. Therefore, customers agree to receive prototype machines from ASML. In the beginning, they have a lot of errors and issues that must be reported back. But by doing so, customers know they get the most productive machine in the fastest way. They know that once ASML machine is up and running, the cost per chip will go down again, increasing their margins. Remember the value of ownership concept? Taking this into consideration, the cooperation between ASML and their customers is another factor that is crucial for their success. And rather than cold sales, these might also be considered partnerships. These partnerships were also reflected in the fact that TSMC and Intel bought ASML stocks as a sign of support when ASML was developing their new and costly EUV technology. The total R&D added up to billions over a period of decades. Today, TSMC and Intel are the biggest customers of ASML and the first ones to receive the new EUV machines in the end of 2023. ASML has built a global ecosystem with many stakeholders like companies, research institutions and governments, in which they are the beating heart. In the coming years, their revolutionary EUV technology is ready for mass production, and this will undoubtedly send waves through the chip sector again. But are there any threats out there from the wizards from Veldhoven? In my next video, I will assess the latest potential threats that might impact the success story of ASML. I hope you like this video, and if so, please subscribe.